Okay, just so everyone knows, I'm recording this because some people wanted to see it later. So I just started recording, and I'm going to share my screen.
就是这个要讲的这个人，就是曾经见过他的女儿和他的儿子，还有他的 wife。
I can't see. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Aaron the tree. Aaron the tree. I mean, Aaron the truck.
哎呦，他们
Okay, let's see if I can get this to share. Set. Okay. Oh, there. Okay. All right, now I can see everybody. Okay. All right. So we have Leah. You want to do the introduction?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Here it is. So the speaker is Scott Wilson. He is professor and chair of the Department of Anthropology at CSULB. He studied race, nationalism, and ethnicity at Stanford University and did field research in Taipei, Taiwan in 1999 to 2000. Scott is currently teaching courses on identity, the history of anthropology, and new media studies. Before COVID-19, he led a study abroad class in Wuhan, China every summer. The lecture is for anyone who's interested in knowing more about race and identity and understanding the current protests. All right.
Thank you, Leah. Okay, so I'll get started. I have about 50 million years to cover, so sounds like a lot. We're not going to spend too much time in the far past, but the talk is called Race, Inequality, and the Current Protests. So it's kind of the last part of the talk. I'll give you the logic here. So, the plan of the talk is, the logic is in order to end racism, we really need to understand what race is. And so I'll be talking about what race is for the first part of it, and then we'll move on to how does that affect people now and why do we have the protests. So I'll get to that, and if you have your question, you can send a text or you can use the hand raise function. You can stop me at any time. So our plan is to understand race so that we can all work together to end racism. And so part one is, it sounds kind of contradictory. Part one is race is not real, and so I'll talk about what anthropologists have discovered about the concept of race and about how it doesn't work as biology and what that means. What does it mean when someone says race is a cultural construction? You'll hear that a lot. When you go to college, when those of you head to college, you will hear that phrase a lot. It's a cultural construction. Well, what does that really mean? Part two is that race is totally real. So yeah, it's kind of contradictory. It may not exist as biology, but through human behavior, we have made it something that's real. So we have made it something that is real. And so part three is fighting for change. And so that's where I get into the protests and what's happening with the death of George Floyd, and about why people may be so angry about that. What's the history behind that? And so, and the third part is like, we can discuss what can we do? And so throughout, sometimes I will ask questions and you can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and just wave and answer the questions. And so there's hopefully at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes where we can just talk about things. And so with that, I will jump in and begin. Okay, so part one, race is not real. What do we mean by that? You can see that I don't look like most of you. You don't look like each other in some ways. People have different skin colors. People have different hair textures and all these different things. So how can you say that race is not real when it's obvious that there are groups of people who look dramatically different from each other? Okay. And so in order to address that, what do I mean by race not being real? We need to talk about evolution. And this is this is what anthropologists study. Physical anthropologists or biological anthropologists, they study human evolution. And so it's a very, very complicated story, but I'm going to give you a very...
Did you mute yourself?
Yeah, if you could try to mute yourself, like so that people can hear. Like, okay, thanks. Okay, so we need to talk about evolution. This is what physical or biological anthropologists look at. We look at the human body. We look at how it's changed over time. And so I'll start with a question. Does anyone know what this animal is? And so Leah and Kai, don't answer because I've already done this with, you've already seen this, so I've given it away. Does anyone want to raise your hand and answer? Who wants to guess what animal this is? Any takers? What does it look like? It doesn't exist anymore. So this is not an animal that you would see in a zoo right now, but it did exist in the past. Does anyone know?
Looks like an anteater.
Looks like an anteater. That's one. That's a good guess. It does look like an anteater, but nope, not an anteater. Anyone else want to guess? Similar, because it has the long snout and everything. Okay, anyone else want to guess? Or you can also guess what animal is it related to now, because it is very closely related to an animal that you have seen before. Okay.
Bear? Like a pig.
A bear, a pig. Yeah, looks like a bear, looks like a pig. Oh, nope.
It's an early mammal, right?
It's a mammal. Yes, it is a very early mammal. I'll give you a hint. It's this is an artist's conception of how this animal looked 50 million years ago.
Aardvark? A wolf?
Aardvark. Good guesses. Yeah, they do look similar. All right.
Wolf?
A wolf? Okay, could be. Okay. You want to
Isn't
hear
it
the
one
answer?
of the progenitor species of all mammals today?
Not quite that early. A little later than that. That would look more like a rat. It'd be smaller. This one's a little big. This one's about the size of a German Shepherd. So a little bigger, so a little bit further along the line. Like the earliest relative of all mammals, like more like a squirrel or a rat, kind of like a rat squirrel. And they kind of took over once the dinosaurs died, right?
Is that the progenitor for the great apes then?
No. Good guess though. All right, let me go to the next slide. It's a whale. What? It's the closest animals that it's related to now would be the humpback whale. You see the bottom of, that's a whale from 50 million years ago. So kind of shocking, right? That when you think of dolphins, you think of whales, and you think of killer whales, you don't think of anything that looks like this, right? But this is how they started.
I've seen that from a museum.
Mm-hmm.
There was like a chart, the same chart.
Yeah. You do see this in natural history museums, but it's kind of shocking, right? You never thought about it. It's like, did a fish just all of a sudden turn into mammals? Why do we have mammals in the ocean? Well, you know, they just slowly adapted to water. They started living more in water. And then over time, that's a Pachycetus, that's what that is. Over time, it just became something different. So it took 50 million years for that animal to slowly adapt to water. And how do they adapt to water? Well, you have genetic mutations. Some animals become more adapted to water, and the ones that survived tended to be the ones that were better adapted to water. And so eventually that species just decided to stay in the water, and eventually the hole kind of moved. It became, those two little ears became ear holes, and then they moved up, and then they merged. And so, but you have to keep in mind that this 50 million years, 50 million years is 50 million years is an extremely long time, right? You can't even imagine how much time it took to do that. So it's not magical. It's not magical. It didn't happen through disasters. It didn't just happen overnight. It took 50 million years. So it's even tough for us to even imagine how long that took for them to become the whales that we know today. And so the process that allows that to happen is called natural selection. So it's when organisms are better adapted to their environment, they tend to survive at a higher rates, and they produce more offspring. So if they have more babies, they live longer. The ones that are not as well adapted, they tend to die out, right? So they outcompete everyone. And this will be really important when we get to talking about humans and where we come from, because we have done the same thing. But what you're going to be surprised about is that evolution is kind of slowed for humans because we have so much technology, and I'll talk about that later. So this is what's associated with Charles Darwin, and it's the main process that brings about evolution. It's called natural selection. So nature selects what works best in every environment. And so For whales, they decided to take to the water. Their closest living relative, by the way, is the hippopotamus. So hippopotamus, if you ever look at videos, you can go on YouTube, hippopotami are very good swimmers. They look very clumsy and slow on land, but if you watch them underwater, they're really good swimmers. So 50 million years from now, the hippopotamus could be another marine species, right? They could be living with dolphins and things because that's kind of where they're headed. So natural selection, you've heard the phrase survival of the fittest. So how long have humans been around? So anybody want to guess? How long have we been around? Our species, Homo sapiens, how long do you think we've been around?
2.4 million. Wait, is it the Homo sapiens or just when did the evolution of humans start?
Just the easier question would be just Homo sapiens, just us, modern humans. It's a tough question because it is very complicated. Some people who were kind of like us were around millions of years ago, and I'll talk about that in a second. But Homo sapiens have only been around for about 200,000 years, maybe 300,000 years. It's a little fuzzy because, again, it's not like one day a woman just pops up and says, "Yay, I'm human." Like, it's a slow process, but about 200 to 300,000 years. And so let's look at the human story a little bit. So this is our hominid, and early hominids. Now, notice I didn't say these are our ancestors. We did not evolve from the ones I'm going to show you first. These are more like cousins to us. And so early hominids, this is one of the most famous ones. The skeleton was called Lucy because the archaeologists that discovered her, then they, analyzed the bones. They could tell it was an adult female. Lucy, they were listening to the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, when they found it, right? So they named her Lucy. She's very famous. You can see her in almost every natural history museum. The actual one is at the Smithsonian. So, so this is Lucy. She was from 3.6 million years ago in Eastern Africa, and she was very small. She was an adult, but she was only like 3.5 feet tall. She was very good at climbing trees. She didn't work totally upright like we do. Still had longer arms, so they lived at least part of their lives in trees. Very hairy, almost like chimpanzees. But if you notice the face, and this is an artist reconstruction, not really like a chimpanzee, but also kind of looks like a person a little bit. So that would be 3.6 million years ago, and that's one of our earliest relatives. And again, not an ancestor. We didn't evolve from them. They were just similar to us. Homo habilis, a little bit later. So something later that emerged. They were a little bit bigger than than Australopithecus. 2.5 million years ago in southern Africa. Let's see. Okay. Homo erectus, 1.9 to 500,000 years ago. Okay, now we're getting to people, they look kind of like this. This is the first one of our relatives that they mastered walking on two legs. Everyone else had long arms. These people look they look very much like us, but if you'll notice, they have much smaller brains than us. They were all over Asia. So most of the fossils for Homo erectus were discovered in China. And if you may have heard of Peking man, like Peking, right, is the old way of spelling Beijing, right? So Beijing man was Homo erectus and looked pretty much like us. They were a little bit smarter than the other ones, walked totally upright, look a lot less like apes, right? So kind of a really big moment for humans, got us to about 1.5 million years ago. Neanderthals, who's heard of Neanderthals? You can do the hand raise button. Neanderthals, this is the people that we talk about as cavemen, right? So this is 0.8, so 800,000 to 300,000. Oh, sorry. To 300,000 years ago. So I said 0.3 million years ago. Bigger brains than us. They had huge bodies. They needed 12,000 calories a day to be healthy. How many calories do you need per day? It's more like 2,000, right? 2,000 to 3,000 is what you eat per day. They needed 12,000 calories. That's like an Olympic athlete. So they really needed a lot of meat. They hunted a lot. Their brains were kind of like ours, maybe even a little bit bigger. So now we're getting much more intelligent. They hunted big game. They had more advanced tools than the others. They lived mostly in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and a little bit into Asia, a little bit. So you've seen stereotypes of Neanderthals, right? And I'll get to what happened to them because I'm going to talk next about what happened to all these people. These are like rough drafts, rough drafts of human, right? So we didn't evolve directly from them, but they're related to us. So these and others, they spread around the world. So all these different groups, all these bones, their timing overlaps. So at any given period from between 500,000 and 3 million years ago, all these different kinds of people were living in the world, and they look radically different. Some lived in trees, some were on the ground. And so they spread around, they just conquered the world because they were much better at hunting than any other animal, and they were smarter, they had tools and all these other things. So they used tools, they hunted, they may have had simple language, we don't know how much. Neanderthals seem to have a little more language than the others. They could talk a little bit. They weren't singing, well, maybe we don't know. They weren't writing plays and novels and things like that, but they were communicating with each other and starting to be much more advanced in terms of social formations and things. So what happened to them? What happened to all these people? Like, we don't see them. Obviously, you've never seen a Neanderthal walking around. Well, let's talk about it. What happened to them? A lot of people think that they became separate races and evolved into Asian people and black. One group became Asian people, one group became black people, one group became Neanderthals, became white people. And there are a lot of people who still believe that, but scientifically, anthropologists have discovered that, you know, what happened to them, and this is called, there's a term for this, it's called multilineal human evolution. It's the belief that different races evolved on different continents. And okay, Rachel has a question.
Yeah, sorry, that's my sister's name.
Oh, okay.
Ben. Yeah, okay. So is it possible that multiple of these human prototypes could have existed on the planet in the same time span?
They did, yeah. That's a very good question, and they did exist at the same time. And we're just starting to piece together. In the past, when people studied this, they used to think, oh, one came and then another came, and then, but no, they lived. Some of them intermixed. A lot of times right now, when people discover fossils, it's hard to place where they are, and so they just invent a new species because it was so diverse. There were so many different kinds of people. Like there were at least 20 last time I counted. I only gave you 4, but there were like 20. And every time someone discovers something, it's like, oh, is it part of this group, or is it intermediate? Is it becoming something else? Is it a deformed individual? Sometimes they really have to, it's really tough to figure these things out. So yeah, they did overlap. And actually modern humans overlapped with Neanderthals, and I'll talk about that in a second. So that was that's one of the theories, that these people became different races. And so a lot of people who believe in race, that it is something that's real, this is what they tie it to, but that's not true. So that previous slide, that they all became different races, it's actually not true. They all died. All those people I just showed you, they died. They went extinct. They're not here anymore. It's very sad, but but with them out of the way, you wouldn't have all of us. If they were still here, you wouldn't be here, right? So they all died. And actually what happened, because another group, one of these groups, one of the relatives, so there are at least 20 different kinds of people. There was another kind of person, it's called Homo heidelbergensis, and I didn't show you that one, but there was a group. Part of them became Neanderthals later, but the other half of them kind of became something very close to us. They were different from Neanderthals, and they started in southern Africa about 300,000 years ago, and you might have heard of them. This is Homo sapiens. And what happens, and so Homo sapiens emerged in southern Africa. They split off from one of these other groups, and they're called Homo sapiens, means thinker. So it's man the thinker. Like Homo erectus means upright man. This means, so usually these names include the most important aspect of these people. The most important aspect of us, of modern humans, is that we have big brains. The frontal part of our brain that controls language and symbolic thought and communication and art and all these other things just got bigger and bigger. They had bigger brains, they had language, they had better tools, better hunters, better gatherers, developed culture, which is really important. So Southern and Central Africa, and here's something that's really important about them. They didn't go anywhere for about 200,000 years, about 230,000 years. They stayed in Africa. And why that's important, so again, this is us, this is modern humans. Why this is important is that everything that's important about them evolved while they were still in Africa, right? So everything that's important about you was already there before these people even left Africa. And so they have not, we as modern humans have spent more time together in Africa than we have outside of Africa. So that's kind of mind blowing, right? So about 70,000 years ago, you can see the red parts of this map. They started in Southern Africa, and then they just spread. They went to the Middle East. They went to Europe. and you know, they went to Europe. They encountered Neanderthals there. They intermarried with them, had babies with them a little bit, but for the most part, they just outcompeted everywhere they went because they were such good hunters, because of their culture, because they had language. They could hunt more. They ate more. They had more children. They lived a lot longer. Neanderthals usually died before the age of 35. So a 30-year-old Neanderthal would be considered a really old person by them, right? So we live until we're 70 or 80 unless we have health problems or an accident or something. So they lived a lot longer. They had more children. They were better hunters. And so everywhere they went, these other people died because they just couldn't compete with us. We still have some Neanderthal genes. If you ever see someone with a hairy back, a really hairy back, or they have like a big lump across their head, like the heavy brow ridges, that means they probably have some Neanderthal genes because we have a little bit of their genes, so that we know that we did intermix with them a little bit, especially European people, because there were more of them in this part of the world. And so you can see they spread from Africa, Middle East, and went to Europe. They turned right. Some of them turned right. They ended up in Asia. Java, Peking man, Beijing man, gone, right? They died out. The Homo erectus died out in Asia. They crossed what was called the Bering Land Strait. They basically walked from Russia to Alaska because you could at that point, 70,000 years ago. The sea level was lower. You could slowly walk from here to there. Usually they were probably following woolly mammoths, right, to eat them. So they followed them. Then they, hey, discovered North America, go into the Americas, keep going south, all the way to South America, right? And so the latest populated part of the world was probably Brazil and Chile, like those places. So it took them a long time to get there because, generally speaking, the group is spread from Africa. So what does this mean? Other prehumans, they just couldn't survive because we were just too good at it. And if you've ever, how many people have seen this movie? The Croods. It's a Disney movie. It's a Disney movie, so it's funny and it's very entertaining, but it kind of tells that story. That's the story of the Croods. This guy named Guy is a modern human. The rest of this is the last Neanderthal family. So he teaches them how to hunt. He teaches them how to tell better stories. And you watch them, like there's a scene where the Croods, you know, he asks the family, he's like, what do you guys do with your leftovers? And they look at him like he's crazy. Like, what's a leftover? Right? They never had leftovers before because it's so hard for them to get so much food because they don't have the technology, right? So they have to spend a lot of effort to get a very little bit of food, and that's why they went extinct, right? So it's a good movie, and it's also a good movie. So I see a hand. Kimmy had your hand up? No, okay, hand is gone. All right, so the Croods, if you want to see a basic version of this. So, and here's the thing that blows my mind every time I think about it. So one tiny community of about 200 individuals grew and multiplied and eventually conquered the entire world. So everybody, I can look at everybody on this screen, everyone you know in your school, everyone in your community, everyone in your hometown, everyone in California, everyone in Russia, everyone in China. All of us are related to this one community of 200 or so people that lived in Southern Africa. Everybody. Isn't that amazing? That's crazy, right? So that's how closely related we all are. We all have the same relatives, and it comes from this one group. They started to multiply and eventually conquered the whole world. And that's what we know as Homo sapiens. And now there are about 1.7 billion of us, right? But we all come from that. So that's about that's a little bit smaller than your school. So there were more people in your school than there were Homo sapiens in the world 300,000 years ago, right? And we're all related to them. So again, I see Rachel's brother has your hand up again.
Yeah, hi. So I have a question about like the spread of the Homo genotype, I guess. Is it genotype or phenotype? I'm not sure.
Genotype. Phenotype is what you look like. Genotype is your genetic makeup, right? Yeah.
All right.
All right.
So was there ever a point in which like Homo sapiens were like close to extinction, or were we like always one of the most dominant species on the Earth?
There was soon after that 200. That's a good question. Soon after that 200 individual mark, there was what's called the bottleneck effect, and so geneticists use it to explain why we are so similar. We are all 99.99% similar genetically, and this very small 0.01% is what accounts for skin color and hair texture, and why. And I'll talk about historically why did we look at that to define races. But you're right, there was a bottleneck effect that kind of cut us down, but we got over that hump and survived extinction. So there was a point in human history when we almost went extinct just like everybody else, but we got over it and thrived for some reason. And they're still looking at why that is, what's so special about us. And the basic answer for that is just our language and our culture. Culture is the ultimate technology, right? It helps us solve our problems. We don't really even need to evolve anymore unless our environment goes so bad that we can't breathe or something. So when humans move to a cold area, we don't grow fur, right? We get heaters, we get jackets, right? So we're not so directly in the environment. But that's a good question. But yeah, we seem to have made over the hump. Some people think we're headed toward another one because of nuclear weapons and global warming, and that could be true. I don't know what's going to happen with humans a million years from now. We probably 1 million years from now, Homo sapiens will probably be living in space or on other planets. And in that case, we may not need legs anymore because we'd be weightless. So there may be humans with, like, I don't know, with 4 hands and with 4 arms instead of legs a million years from now. We don't know, right? So it depends on what environment we live in. Okay, so what does this have to do with race? So now we're getting to race. Each and every one of us is descended from that small little tribe of 200 people. And that's how closely related we are. It's a long time to think about, 300,000 years, but in terms of evolution, when you think about whales, it took 50 million years for whales to go from these little dogs to the things we know now. This is a blink of an eye in terms of evolution. Really not enough time for anything important to develop, and everything that's special about you, how smart you are, how talented you are, how athletic you are, humans already had that before we even left Africa. So we basically are still in our infancy as a species. We're very new still, right? So despite all the amazing things we've done, we're still very new. And so every gene related to hair, skin color, eye shape, personality traits, talents, athletic ability, intelligence, eye color, we already had them. They developed before we left Africa. So it's only been 70,000 years. Hasn't been enough time. So I'm going to speed through some of these in order of time. Okay, so then the question becomes, if we're so closely related, why do we look so different? Why do people look so different? Because you can look at these people, the guy in the middle and the woman on the right, they don't look anything like each other. They look so different. How do you explain that? And how can you say that race isn't a real thing when people look so different? What does that even mean? Like, how deep does that go? How do you see a person's race? So what do you think about, so I can ask the question, what do you use, how do you know what race someone is? If we can talk about race the way we normally talk about it. How do you know what race someone is? So if I ask you, hey, that person gave me $10, and I say, which person? How would you define, you would probably use their race to point out which person it is, right? What we use things like skin color, eye shape, hair texture, nose shape, right? So that's how you would know the difference between me and some of the other people on the Zoom, right? But what anthropologists have found is that these are very, genetically speaking, these are very superficial traits, and more importantly, they're not connected to anything else. Like hair texture and skin color are different. We do look very different, but they're not connected to anything else like intelligence or anything like that. So these are very minor changes in human evolution. Again, we're still babies. Like we have not been outside of Africa that long, right? So, but that has been enough time for us to look different in terms of hair texture. So there's a lot of information here. You can look at the video later, and maybe the slides will post them somewhere. But why do people have different skin colors? Well, it depends on where your ancestors lived in the past 10,000 years. So they adapted to the environment. 10,000 years is time for some very minor changes to happen. So if they lived in a place with a lot of sunlight, natural selection picked dark skin tones because melanin acts as a natural sunblock. So if you use sunblock when you go to the beach, it's to avoid being suntan, right? To being burned. You don't want to be burned. When I go to the beach, I don't use sunburn. I don't use sunblock because I don't need it. I have sunblock, right? Because my ancestors lived in a part of the world, and it's not just Africa. Africa, yes, but other parts of the world too, and I'll show you in a second. Natural selection, the same thing that led to whales to be living in the water, kind of gave those people dark skin. In places with very mild sunlight, like in Northern Europe, they developed very white skin. And actually, that group of, it's still a little bit of a question, but that small group of 200 people probably had dark skin because that's just what developed there first. And so, but the ones who made it all the way up to Europe and then later to China, they developed white skin because there's less sunlight there. And so I'm gonna go back actually. There's less sunlight in those northern places, and you need sunlight to make vitamin D. You need vitamin D to have strong bones, and our body takes sunlight and turns it into vitamin D. And those who lived in very northern climates, there was less sun, so it helps them to have white skin. And so, yes, they get sunburned, but they don't have as much sun there, so they don't, they don't have as much problems with being sunburned and skin cancer and things like that. So they develop light skin to process more vitamin D for their bones, right? And so that's why people in Europe develop white skin. That's why people in Asia develop relatively light skin, because those environments are very different from the tropical climates. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so this is a skin color map. You can see this is a map of tropic zones, right? And this is related to how the Earth is tilted. The Earth is tilted, and those places near the equator, they just get much more sunlight. They get more ultraviolet radiation. You need dark skin to protect yourself there, and so this is how natural selection worked. People with darker skin lived longer. They had more children. Their children lived longer. They had more kids. People with lighter skin were more likely to get skin cancer or anything else that comes from ultraviolet radiation. So Africa, yes, we know, but also people who lived here, South America, Southeast Asia, India, they're very dark people in India, right? So it's not about being dark skinned, it's not about being African, it's about, well, your ancestors, where did they live? What did they need? And what did they evolve, right? And so as you go north, you can see things get lighter. China's over here, right? So China's in the lighter areas, but then if you go north of China, Russia, across to Northern Europe, Ireland, and the UK is over here, very white skinned. Canada, right? People who were in Canada for thousands of years developed whiter skin too. And so what's interesting about this, again, I'm gonna keep going. Okay, 305, all right. All right, so, but there are other ways. So this is a skin tone chart. We could also group people in other ways. This is type B blood, right? You could draw a map with, okay, so that's that's a map with skin color. We could also do it with what kind of blood do you have? But we don't use blood to make race. We use skin color to make race. We could draw a map of people who have type B blood. The darker the area, the less type B blood alleles you'll find. And so I don't want to dwell on that just to save time, but we don't associate blood type B with intelligence or with athletic ability or with leadership or other racial characteristics. Like we don't stereotype people with blood type B, even though we could draw a map based on that too. It's just based on geography. Skin color, based on geography. It's your ancestors' geography. Blood type B, your ancestors' geography, totally different map, right? And so how many races are there? And so historically, we developed this idea that there are races. And so how many are there? Usually, this is an old thing. We don't use this anymore because, again, we anthropologists don't think there is such a thing as race. It's just an idea. Black people, Negroid, right? Caucasian, Caucasoid, white, American, Native American, I was never taught that one. I was never taught that one particularly, but yeah, Native Americans. Actually, a lot of charts would put Native Americans in the Mongoloid type with Asian people because basically they came from. Okay, could you mute yourself? Who was that? Okay, so. Okay, in reality, it's a trick question. So I could ask you how many races are there? It's a trick question because they're not real. And this is around 2003, they finished mapping out the human genome. And one of the surprising findings was that you can't see race at the genetic. If I look at your DNA, I can't tell what racial group you are because race is an idea. It's a cultural category. It's not a biological category. So, and you can see here in this Scientific American, genetic results may surprise you. And they found that no, it doesn't exist. You can't look at someone's DNA and tell that they're Chinese or that they're Black. They're just starting to be able, okay, yeah, I can see how dark someone's skin is, but there are Chinese people who are whiter than white people. There are white people who are darker than some people we consider Black, right? So you can see someone's skin tone, but that doesn't really tell you everything you need to know about how we group races, right? So, okay, your hand again, yeah.
Yeah, so organizations like 23andMe, like if you take their genetic test, they can tell you like, oh, you're like 43% like Levantine Jew, for example.
Right.
Like, how does that kind of
It does. It's geographical. They don't really give you a racial classification. My daughter Leah, who's here, we did one for her, and we found that, no surprise, I'm her dad. She was like 30%. She was 30% Central and Southern African, and then 30%. Like, it was funny, like 33% African, 33%, 40% Northern Chinese and Korean. But then there was the rest of it was European. There was Irish and Welsh, and I forget what the other one was. I think German maybe. But so this whole, even that's geographical, right? They don't give you a race. They just give you, your ancestors lived in this part of the world probably. And so it's predominantly African and Chinese, and Korean, because of where my wife is from, northern China, so close to Korea, but also English. And based on that, they could tell that her chart said that her family probably lived in North Carolina, which is where I'm from. And so they could tell based on the percentages that most African American people in North and South Carolina have this balance, have about this much English and German in them, right? And so it is, we're all mixed, and that's kind of the thing. We're all mixed. 23andMe just shows you what your mixture is. No one's pure anything, right? And so just to move on, like, two different kinds of people. So are these two different kinds of people? They look radically different. They look like two races, right? Most people would look at this and say, there's a black race and there's a white race, right? Turns out, this person's very dark. This one's very white. They have different eye color and everything. They do look like two different kinds of people. But, if you walked, and this is a famous example, the one on the left, the black woman, looks like she's from somewhere in the darker parts of Africa. The other woman looked to be Irish. So let's say you walked from this part of Africa, just kept walking, if you follow my cursor, you walked up here, cross the Straits of Gibraltar, go into Spain and France, and then take the tunnel and go up here and come out. And there is at no point, you would just see a gradual lightening. There is no borderline. There is no place where you stop seeing black people and you start seeing white people. What these two people represent is the end of a spectrum, right? So when you see them side by side, they look like two different kind of people. But what's missing here is all the skin tones that are between them, and there's no dividing line. There are no borders there, right? So why do we think they're two different races? Well, it's a race is imaginary. Those dividing lines between those groups, they don't exist. Biologists and anthropologists have proven this, that there is no border. There is no place where you stop seeing black people and you start seeing white people just magically. No, it just gets gradually lighter and lighter. Race doesn't exist at the genetic level. Skin color and hair texture are such minor genetic variations that, genetically speaking, you can be more similar to someone in a different race than you can be to someone within your own race. And in fact, skin color just throws us off, right? You can be genetically more similar to someone who looks radically different from you because there's a very, very tiny amount of genes that account for skin color. We don't see that because we focus on the skin color part. Oh my God, okay. All right, I'm gonna keep moving. Other things we could focus on. How many people can curl your tongue that way? I can't. Raise your hand if you can curl your tongue that way. That's one gene that determines that. We could focus on that. I saw Annie did it. I'm like, I saw you. Like, if you can do that, that's one gene. Your earlobe, does it attach to your head or does it drop? Again, that's one gene that determines that. You can look at it in your family. Does it droop like this or does it go straight into your head? That's one gene. You can check yourself, right? That's one gene. Cilantro, is it yummy or does it taste soapy to you? I could give you a map of people who think that cilantro is gross, right? It's one gene, right? So genes can appear to be very important, but they're just very minor things sometimes. Does your thumb go straight up or does it go back in a hitchhiker's thumb? That's one gene. We could use these very simple genes to form groups of people as well, but we focus on skin color. Why do we focus on skin color so much? Well, here's the source. This is where it started. It's an idea. It didn't exist far back in history. Slavery in the US and Europe. It's the first time in human history that really dark people lived in close contact with really white people. And so you took those two sides of the scale, a really white person, really black person, put them together, and yeah, you start to think, maybe these are two different kinds of people, especially when one group is ranked much higher, the slave owners, the white people, and one group is ranked much lower, the lower people, the slaves, right? And so they started to think, and so scientists started to ask the question, what's the difference between these two people? Why are these people so rich and these people so poor? Why are they so dominant and why are these people so sick? And why are they enslaved? What's wrong with these people, right? And that's when they invented the idea of race. And so they searched for the answer, what's wrong with Black people? And they found their answer because they just had this bias that they already knew the answer to the question was, you know, when your assumption is that one group is inferior, that's the question you will answer. And so they were searching for ways to define why Black people are inferior to white people. And so they thought skin color and hair texture were related to a person's place in society. And so they wanted to explain that, white at the top and Black at the bottom. To them, this was all just natural. And there was a term for that. We call it manifest destiny. Things are as God created them and we can't change it. So this is how society is. Let's figure out what's wrong. Even if you're trying to help them, hey, let's figure out what's wrong with Black people, right? So they thought there was a relationship between skin color and things like intelligence, talents, aptitude, and your potential to contribute to society, right? So this was the birth of this concept of race. It was invented in America in the 1800s. You may have heard of Nazis, but you know, Hitler. But Hitler and the Nazis learned this stuff from Americans, right? So that stuff started here. It didn't exist in ancient times. No one cared a long time ago about your skin color until slavery. In pre-modern times, it was more about language, religion, your ruler, where you were from. That was much more important in terms of defining who you were. And here's a question I like to ask my classes: what color was Jesus? You know, we have all these different pictures of this person who lived in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. People have written tomes of books, written all this stuff about him. But one thing they didn't write about, you know, you got the white Jesus here, you've got like kind of a brown Jesus, you've got this other one here, and then you've got a Black Jesus. No one can agree, and the reason it's difficult is because no one wrote about what color his skin was, because no one cared about it, right? No, it didn't matter. In fact, one of these, which one do you think? 1, 2, 3, and 4. A bunch of anthropologists got together and tried to come up with a real picture of what this person looked like. Which one do you think is the most accurate one for where he lived and at what time? One of them was one of these pictures came from a scientific study. They really tried to find, what did this person most likely look like? You might want to guess which one you think.
Probably
People are
number
saying
3.
it in the chat right
Oh, someone's in the chat. Oh, I can't see the chat right now with sharing my screen. What's the question? You can read it, Leah. I can't see the chat.
Okay, a lot of people said 1. Some people said 3.
Okay.
Veronica said 2. First person said 2.
Okay. So I will, just for the sake of time, like I'll tell you, it was this one, number 3, actually is the one they came up with. I would have guessed number 2 too, actually. I've just seen the article and they kind of got together, physical anthropologists, and that he probably looked something like number 3, based on what people where he lived at that time most likely looked like. They decided, but it doesn't matter. My point here is just no one bothered to write about that because to them it didn't matter. Race didn't exist back then. They wouldn't have said, oh, well, it didn't matter. There was no meaning associated with what color his skin was because they didn't have race yet. Okay, so part 2, race is totally real. And yeah, time-wise, I'm not doing that well. So, race is socially constructed. You'll hear this a lot. When you go to college, you're gonna hear this phrase all the time. Something is social constructed. You hear about gender too, but here we're talking about race is socially constructed, but we make it real. It means that just because it's constructed doesn't mean that it's not real. So how do we make it real? Laws were designed to favor whites in America and disadvantage non-whites. And there's a lot of examples in this, and I'm gonna go through it very quickly. Even after, so slavery is an obvious example, right? But that's how American society started. In the 1800s and 1900s, during and after slavery, Black people were subjected to Jim Crow laws. Immigration from China was banned for 60 years. They didn't want any more Chinese people for a long time until the 60s. Native Americans were forced into reservations. And so you had this whole society that was structured around white people being at the top. And they made laws and they had cases and they did things to ensure that that continues. And that's one of the problems with what's going on right now, that this is the root of how what America came to be. Some examples, there are a lot of examples. The GI Bill, if you've heard of that, if you serve in the military, they will pay for your college and da da da. Well, the original version of that, they would help you buy a house and they would help you go to college. But it was supposed to be for all GIs coming back from World War II, but they only gave it to white soldiers. They didn't give it to black soldiers, they didn't give it to Asian soldiers, and they didn't give it to Native American or any other soldiers. So, um, so you know, that did a lot of damage, right? Because what happened was a lot of white families were able to accumulate wealth that they held in real estate, and so a whole generation of white families where the government helped them save a lot of money, right? And they didn't open that up to other people. It was fixed in 1968 with the Civil Rights Act movement, but this is a big crush. This is how race becomes real. It became a real thing that white people are wealthier and everyone else is not, right? Redlining, long story short, banks assign their interest rates based on how white a neighborhood was. If you were in an all-white neighborhood and you were a white person, you got a really low interest rate on your mortgage. If you were in a black or mixed neighborhood with black and Latino, you would get a really high interest rate. And if you have a really high interest rate, it's really difficult to pay off your house. This did a lot more damage because black and Latino, and in some cases Asian people, were not able to own their houses because they were paying too much interest. So when we get into that, some of the adults probably get more of that. This was how a race was made real. And the consequence is the average white family has 10 times the net wealth of the average black family. And Latinos are somewhere in the middle, but they're closer to the black end. So the government helped white families build up a huge amount of wealth in the 20th century. And it has just led to an uneven playing field. And if you have more wealth and you live in a white neighborhood, you have better schools. You have friendlier police, and we'll get to that in a second. You have more jobs, you have all these different things, whereas these other communities do not have those things, and so they have less opportunity to do them, and the government helped make this true. Okay, so in the 90s, you had something else that happened. So this is when I'm leading up to the protests and why people are so angry. The war on drugs in the 1990s, you could research that, led to the police becoming a military force. And so police went from being community police that were friendly. I heard my wife said that in China, you as a child, they were taught, about Jing Cha Shu Shu, right? Like uncle policeman, right? Very friendly. They know you. They're like one of your neighbors, and they're there to protect you. Well, a lot of black communities and Latino communities in cities in the 90s were subject. The police became more of a military force because there was this problem with drugs, and so they were militarized. Community policing became rare. They saw the police saw the community as the enemy, and they were to be thrown in jail. Police brutality became normal and accepted. Gangs formed originally to protect their communities because the police weren't doing that, and so a lot of the gangs that you see originally started as ways for communities to protect themselves. Later, they started selling drugs and it became an even bigger issue, but that's why those things happen. And so until video cameras came along, became small and affordable and part of our smartphones, no one ever believed that these things with police were happening in these communities. And so police brutality became a really big issue in the 1990s, and it's continued even now. That's why people are so frustrated, because they can't believe this is still happening. Police don't belong to the communities they work in, so they don't know anybody, right? They just see racial differences and they act on it. They see them as a threat. Black and brown neighborhoods become violent as poverty worsens. Poverty, violence, and crime always follows poverty everywhere it goes. And so it's easy to see these things, violence and criminality, as racial traits, but it's really about poverty. The problem in America is that poverty follows dark skin tone too, because our laws have kind of ensured that, right? Our laws over the course of the last 150 years have ensured that poverty will follow. The darker your skin tone, you could draw a graph. The darker your skin tone, the poorer you're going to be, with exceptions, and it has improved, but that's how America was kind of built. And so schools in poor communities are underfunded. Students suffer. Vicious cycle develops for young black men. Schools, gangs, prison. There really aren't any good choices to make. So people do their best they can. Sometimes people escape it through sports or through studying really hard and making it out. But you end up, this is the George Floyd situation here. This is what people are tired of. This is not an isolated incident. It's not that it just happened one time. This became emblematic of a history of this, because of, you actually see this man die when he did that. And so it just really inflamed a lot of people's emotions. Why do people protest? Well, they seek an end to structural racism, because as I just showed you at the beginning, we're all the same. We just have different skin tone, and that's more about history and geography. That has nothing to do, the color of your skin does not have anything to do with how good you are at math, right? How good you are at basketball. Those things come from hard work. They come from sticking to it. They come from parents that know how to help you figure out difficult math problems and making you do the work, right? They come from having the time to do the work. Basketball is the same way. Canadians are good at hockey because they play it a lot, right? They work really hard at it. And so this is not about skin tone, right? And so it's just that some people have more opportunities than others. It's more about money than it is about skin tone, right? So they protest because they want to end structural racism, which is what I just described. Black people can't solve racism. They can fight it, but it'll take a collective effort to make change. And I'm almost at the end here, and we'll talk a little bit. Okay, 10 minutes, not too bad. Why do people riot? Well, Martin Luther King Jr. once said that in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard. It means these are people, sometimes they don't vote, and that's part of a problem, and politicians know they don't vote, and so it's really easy to ignore them. They don't vote, or they don't have enough money to really influence elections, and so our politicians really don't need to pay attention to them, and so they continue to suffer. The police continue to be too heavy-handed and rough with them, and sometimes they die, which is what happened here, and it's happened in a lot of other cases. And you can say, anyone can say this, and I can say this about myself too, that if you can't understand why people would riot, your privilege has been protecting you from being that frustrated. Maybe you've just never been that frustrated. They feel like there's a hopelessness there with people who riot, that they feel like there's nothing else they can do when they just act out of rage. It is not productive. It doesn't help. But if we can empathize a little bit, not for some people are just out to cause trouble. Some people are just out to get a new TV and loot and things like that. We're not talking about them. That's silly, and those people should go to jail. But what we're talking about is that sometimes these things start when people just get so frustrated that no one listens to them and no one believes them, that they just act out in violence. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just what tends to happen everywhere. There are riots that happen in China among poor farmers that have their land taken away, right? Sometimes when you feel like you have no other choice, you just act out in violence, right? One thing I could suggest is, like, don't try to be colorblind. Sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, I don't see color. Like, no, you should see color. Color exists, right? Race may not be biological, but it's real socially. And so if you try to be colorblind, and that means you're ignoring the struggles that someone else, the difficulties or the challenges that someone else might have in their lives. And so we need to be color conscious instead. You need to be conscious of color. It doesn't mean to be racist. It doesn't mean don't assume and don't make assumptions and stereotype people, but you should be aware that people have different experiences, a lot of cases because of their skin color. We can't defeat race as a concept without dealing with the damage it has done. And so one day we can move beyond race and let go of it. But until then, we need to be aware of how race works for some people and against other people. And so that's what being color conscious is about. It doesn't mean that you're going to stereotype people or be mean to people who have had advantages. It just means that we all need to work together on this. And so I'll end with this. The difference between
Please mute yourself.
Heck, who's that? Okay, so we can end with equality versus equity. And a lot of people who want to be colorblind, they would say, like, we should just treat everyone the same. People should be treated equally. Well, if you look at the people standing on the fence, these people have different opportunities. The tall guy can already see the baseball game. He doesn't need the box. The person in the middle can see the game with the box, but not without the box. The person on the end, if you give them one box, they still can't see the game. And so equality is good, and that's not a bad thing, but equity is a better word. Equity means let's try to get everyone on the same level. And what that requires is taking account of race and how the damage that has done. Some of the things we need to do, some people need more. The short person needs 2 boxes. The one in the middle just needs 1. The one in here has had more advantages over history, so they don't need a box at all. And so they have to work together to try to get everyone on the same level. And so equity is what the protesters are fighting for. So yes, to some people, like the tall person here, may feel like this is unfair. It's like, hey, why didn't I get a box? Well, dude, you don't need a box. Like, why, so this person needs a little bit, but they don't need that much. This person needs a lot of help. And so that's what the protesters are looking for. Equity is very different from equality, because if you just treat everyone equally, not for everyone, we're not saying forever, this should change. Once everyone's on the same level, then we can have equality. If you just go for equality, then you're leaving all of the unfairness in place, right? So if you just go for the equality part, then that doesn't change anything. So yes, everything is divided equally, but some need more than others. And so that's what America has not done a good job at. And that's what the protests have kind of arisen from. Um, okay, what can we do? You can ask yourself, is your local environment equitable? Is there equity just around you, at work, at school, among your friends? Is everyone included that can be included? Are we listening to everyone? You can be an ally. If you see someone has a struggle and it's about race or something, you can form a club with them, coalitions, make connections, work together. Know the history, some of the things that I've talked about. It's really good to know the history so that you can diagnose problems. Read, watch films about it. Help change the language. When you hear people talking unfairly in terms of racial, we've heard discrimination against Chinese people because of COVID-19, right? When people say racist things to them, like, how that feels, where imagine, that's bad and we can work on that too. We try to affect the language so that people can't get away with saying these things, or at least know that there are consequences for saying these things because they really hurt people. You can educate others once you've educated yourself. And then you can remember all the way back how closely related we are. We're all from that one little tribe. We're all related to that one little group that took over the world. And so I'm going to stop there. And any questions? I mean, I have like 5 minutes. I can stay a little bit longer if people want to. Any questions about anything? I'm going to unshare because I can't see everything here.
Yep, there's a couple of questions on the chat.
Okay, let me see. I can't see my whole menu for some reason.
Yeah, I can. Someone
chat. Okay.
asked about the 1+6T asked why are 70% Black children born without a father?
70%. Okay, I'm not sure about the statistics, and I have seen that somewhere. Well, they have to be born with a father because. But well, okay. So think about the neighborhoods. I don't know. I don't know offhand the statistics compared to other groups. If you live in, okay. I'm gonna mute someone. Okay, so if you grow up in one of these communities, think about the difficulties with unemployment. There are a lot of challenges in these communities, and one of the things I can point to, one of the previous slides, I talked about how those in the 1980s and 1990s with the war on drugs, there was a big push to build more prisons and to put people into prison. So unlike the meth epidemic that we're experiencing right now, which is predominantly white people, in the 1980s and 90s, crack, cocaine was mostly Black people. And so with the meth issue right now, they treat it as a public health crisis. Like, hey, let's treat these people, let's try to get them off drugs. With crack in the 80s and 90s, again, because of the racial bias in American laws, Black men were treated as criminals, right? So instead of saying this person has a drug problem, let's put them in rehab and try to get them off drugs and solve their issue. They put them in prison instead. And so a lot of Black children lose their fathers to prison because they don't, the police do not see an alternative. It was not treated as a public health issue. It was treated as a criminality issue. And so it was part of that whole militarization of the police. And it has improved a little bit, but those prisons are still there. If you think about marijuana becoming legal recently, there are hundreds of thousands of Black men in prison for having a little bit of marijuana in their car. At the same time as in California, a lot of middle-aged people, white people predominantly, are opening their own marijuana shops. So, you talk about equity. So you've got someone who had a little bit of marijuana in their car back when it was illegal, gets 20 years in prison because maybe they had some other crime. Whereas someone who's legally selling marijuana is making a lot of money. So that's what we mean with equity. And so some states like California have let some of those people who were in prison for possession. But that's where, I don't want to go from that rabbit hole, but yeah, that's one of the things, like the violence that was done to these communities takes fathers away from homes. Sometimes fathers choose to leave, but it's not, you have to look at the pressures they were under. And so that's a good question. It is something to think about. Individual responsibility does play a part, but you have to look at the structural dimensions of it too. It's more difficult to keep a family together in a community that's under a lot of social pressures and things. And so it's, it takes a little empathy. It's very complicated. It's not quite that simple, but yeah, it's a good question though. Any other questions? Yeah, for some reason, even when I hit view chat, I can't see my chat. I can't see the chat box, so I might need help with the questions.
That's the only question I see so far, but everyone can speak up. They can unmute themselves right now.
Yeah, unmute yourself. You can just ask the question out. Yeah. Yeah, for some reason. Okay. Okay, so, you know, just think about what you can do. Yeah, just you can, protesting is one, some people find protesting, it helps them feel better. You know, one thing I will say about the protest, they have changed the conversation. So in some ways it has been successful. This is all anybody's talking about right now. I don't appreciate the violence. I don't like looting. I don't think people should be attacking police cars, but the point of protesting is to be noticed and to be heard. One of the best protest signs I've seen is one that says, "Can you hear us now?" Right? Because Black people have been saying, why do the police come into our communities and automatically assume that Black men have weapons and tend to kill them this way? And so for decades, this had been happening, but no one believes them because we didn't have video. Now, about once every 2 weeks, you see these videos of white officers unnecessarily killing Black men who do not have weapons or anything. So Yiheng Zhao has a question. Yeah.
I don't know if you guys can hear me.
I can, yes.
Okay. So I'm trying to explain myself. I'll try my best. So for the equality and the equality, sorry about my pronunciation.
Equity and equality, yeah.
So basically, my question is, because as a Chinese myself, I kind of like looking this situation as from an outside perspective. It's always confused me why people don't come up. Personally, I think the biggest argument is two solutions. None of them are perfect, and none of them satisfy everyone. So why not people trying to come up with a better idea to trying to figure out a better solution, like satisfy most of the people? Why not two sides just sit down trying to find a better solution instead of just competing with each other?
Right, and that's a good question. One of the things, there's a lack of leadership, I think. We don't have a Martin Luther King Jr. right now. We don't have a president who wants to have these conversations right now, right? No one's perfect. Academics and scientists have tried to work on these things, but you know, you're right, it takes a collective effort to really try to resolve the issues. I mean, we could start with, hey, you know, since the riot started about police brutality, we could can we have some kind of organization formed by community members that can review police practices, right? So don't let the police department investigate themselves, because what always happens is that they always clear themselves, right? They always say, oh, well, this is really bad, let's investigate it. And then they say, oh, no, they didn't do anything wrong. And they pat themselves on the back. We need citizens who belong to the community to really be able to look at what police are doing and to talk about it and to present evidence and to say that this is not right, we don't want this. Even if the officers don't kill someone, sometimes, hey, you guys are going too far. Like some of the riots, we're going to have more conversations because there are a lot of instances of brutality during these protests where police are attacking protesters apparently for no reason. So a lot of these things, some of them have been fired already, some of them have been charged with things, but we need to have a way to who watches the police officers. And so Ferguson had that 5 years ago after Freddie Gray and the riots that happened after that. They set up a commission saying like, okay, this is a group of citizens and a group of police officers, and they're going to talk to each other, and they're going to say, hey, just the fact that they're talking to each other can be a positive impact, right? So even if they don't come up with a solution, they get to know each other. And so what anthropologists and other people who study race have found is that the more you know about someone, the more you talk about someone, the less racist you will be, the less biased you will be. And so that's really all it is. It's about reforming those connections that we used to have in our communities that we don't have anymore. And so anyone can go on Twitter and WeChat or Facebook and just say anything right now, but we don't talk to each other. We just talk to people who already agree with us, right? And so that's really unproductive. We need to argue with each other, right? We need to discuss these things. So you're right. It's we need better community leaders, and we do have some people who work really hard. We need community leaders, we need state leaders, and we need federal leaders in the White House and things who really, regardless of everything else, you could at least ask the president to talk about this and to say that you're going to try to come up with the solutions instead of saying looting is bad, bring in the army. That's just really not helping. So I mean, and a Republican president can do that, a Democratic president can do that, anyone can do that, but we just don't have that right now. So I think, and we will work it out. I think we'll be okay. I think we will figure, I think the riots are already starting to end. The protests will die down a little bit. And then we get to the work of coming up with solutions. The protests were successful because it changed the conversation. No one's even talking about COVID-19 anymore, which is not necessarily a good thing. I think that's a bad thing, but you know, it changed the conversation. They're being heard now. So it's a first step. And the police officers being charged with murder was a good thing. I don't know if they're going to be convicted, but probably just to show that community that, yeah, we hear you, we care, and we also consider this to be murder because that guy didn't do anything to deserve that kind of treatment, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
Someone has a question.
Okay.
Song asks, what do you think of the improving education opportunities for the African American? Does the community realize that is their way to get taller? I'm not sure if they're finished.
I know what you mean. Yeah, to get taller, they do. It's the difficulties. When you have a school with 40 to 45 students in a classroom, it's very difficult. Some people make it out. I mean, I didn't come from a poor neighborhood. We were okay. We were kind of poor, but we were poor working class, I guess, but working poor. But so there are always going to be a few people who do make it out, but they do realize that education is important, but you have to have a space to have education. And when you don't own a house sometimes and you have multiple family members living with you, it's hard to have a desk. It's hard to have quiet time to study. It's far less likely that their parents are educated, right? I can even speak to my kids, both of their parents have PhDs, right? We know how to study, we know how to write. We know, my wife knows how to do math. I don't know how to do math, but we have the resources to help them because we own property. We live in a neighborhood in Cyprus that has very good schools compared to almost all districts. But that's because we have the wealth to do that. And so in poor communities, I've never seen a poor Black community that didn't value education, but it's just so damn hard. Oh, sorry. It's just so hard for them to do well in school when they have so many challenges and difficulties and things. So it's a resource question. That's also true for poor white people. It's also true for poor Asian people. There are poor Chinese people in California. So when you go, you know, like we live in a bubble here in Cyprus because, you know, all of your parents are engineers and doctors and things like that, and scientists and statisticians and everything. It's kind of a bubble. There are poor Chinese people in China, and they have the same struggles that Black people do. So again, it's not about race, it's about opportunity and resources. And so there's a film I can recommend that I show in my class, and at the end they talk about how when you adjust for education level, and you're right, the person who asked the question is right. When you have a higher education, you will have a higher income. It doesn't change wealth. If you go back to that graph, like with the average white family having 10 times the wealth of the average black family, income doesn't really change that until you start to own property, and then the next generation, your kids can inherit that property and it becomes more valuable. That's how you accumulate wealth. And that's what white people have been doing for 400 years, whereas Black people have only been able to do that for about the last like 50 years, right? So they're behind. But there are poor white people, there are poor Asian people, and they have the same education outcomes as poor Black people. So it's not about the fact that they're Black, it's about the fact that they're poor. It just so happens, and I showed you the history, some of it, that there's a higher preponderance, there's a higher percentage of Black people who are poor in America because of our history. And so we think of it as a Black trait, but it's actually a poor trait. It's a class trait. It's a trait of poverty. Crime rates a little bit higher percentage-wise among Black people. Well, it's just because more Black people are poor, right? Crime follows poverty. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. White poor people commit a higher rate of crimes. White poor Asian people commit a higher level of crime. So skin color and hair texture and what you look like and where your ancestors were from is really not the determinant. It's the determinant is how much money how big are the classes in your school. how much can you afford after school programs like Wuhan and things. And so that's what you don't have in poor communities, and that's what the difficulty is. So it's not about their blackness, it's about the fact that they're poor. And that's true across the racial spectrum. So if you look at the level of education among Black people who have things like a BA, an MA, or a PhD, they have the same level of success as any other race. It's just the difficulty, they have more difficulty getting to that level. So again, a few exceptions make it, maybe because, you know, they're just tougher, or maybe they had a mentor that helped them. They had a social worker, they had a volunteer who, hey, I'm gonna tutor you in math after school. I'm gonna do that I can't do much, I'm only one person, but I'm gonna pick 2 kids and we're gonna tutor them in math and help them do better in school so that they can get out of this and help their families, right? And so, that's what privilege means. Privilege doesn't mean you don't deserve something. Privilege just means that you have something that other people don't have. So if you have parents who are very educated and can help you with their homework, that is a form of privilege, but good for you. You deserve it. Your parents worked very hard to get their degrees. But you have to empathize with people who don't have that, right? Who don't, because historically their parents had a harder time owning property. They had a harder time moving to a wealthy neighborhood with good schools, right? But they have the same capacity. Again, genetically, we're all almost 100% the same, except for a few minor differences. Intelligence, it's not about intelligence. In some cases, it's not about hard work. Individuals, you know, are responsible for their own thing, but some people have more challenges than others, and a lot of it is it really does come down to money and resources and what you do with them. So, you know, one thing that
yeah,
people could be tutoring.
there are a few
Okay.
comments, not really questions, but
Okay.
just things people said. So Jirfang said, education for us is a natural thing, but for people who are really deprived, it's such a bigger challenge to pursue education as we do. It's a class issue further entrenched by racial issues.
Yes, right. Totally agree. My fellow anthropologist, Professor Song. Yeah, it is. It's entrenched. Race and class are so tangled together in American history, and in a lot of other countries too, but specifically in America, race and classes are entangled. It's hard to know which one you're talking about, right? Are you talking about poverty, or are you talking about race? Well, when you talk about class differences in America, you are talking about race because of how we made it, how the government and our policies and the laws made it that way for the last few hundred years. And so we're trying to get beyond that, but we have to look at it. We have to have some very difficult conversations, as long as we can realize that some people had more challenges than others. Again, equity is the goal. Equality is great, but equity is the first step, right? Until we get on an equal playing field, we can't treat everyone the same, because some people have more resources, they have more opportunity, they have more help, you know, with education, right? And that's, again, privilege. When you hear the term white privilege a lot, and people shouldn't take that personally, you know, like I know a lot of white people and none of them ever owned slaves because we're not old enough, but they can at least recognize that, hey, my family was able to accumulate wealth because of policies and things that I wouldn't agree with now, but yeah, you did benefit from them. Other people did not benefit from them. So what can we do to kind of equal things out? And so to people who used to benefit from all of these old policies, sometimes equity feels like it's unfair to them. Like, hey, why are you helping that kid and you didn't help me? Well, I can look at you and see that you have help, right? Your parents can help you with their homework. You don't need a free after school program because you can afford to do one. And yeah, that feels unfair, but again, it's about equity. It's not about equality. Everyone doesn't need to be treated the same way. Until sometime in the future where everybody's on the plane. I don't know how long that would take, but it's very obvious when we're not even trying, right? So, and yeah, we've made a lot of progress. You know, the lives of Black Americans are dramatically better than they were for Black Americans in the 1950s and 60s. I would not want to time travel back because my life is better than my parents' lives were when they were kids. But we still have some ways to go. Still some ways to go, you know. Okay. Sorry.
Are there any other questions? Like, because
yeah, we're over
you can't
time.
see the chat. You can't see the chat, but yeah.
I see Yicheng Zhao raise hand. I see a raised hand.
Yes,
Go ahead.
Because one question, because actually in ancient China, our stereotype of the Black people considered to be like kind and honest and actually really smart. So the difference in the stereotype can be a proof of how it's actually the problem with the society and not the race. And also, So my question, because I'm not quite familiar with American Black history, so I was wondering because considerably the reason why white people brought Black people here to be slaves supposed to be selected. So the people who kept as slaves supposed to be kind of like more honest and hardworking and supposed considerably to be better people already. So it's actually doesn't quite make sense if they talk about it genetically they're not good people, because suppose if they are good, why they keep them as slaves?
Okay, so one of the things they kept doing, it wasn't it wasn't about them being better people. The ones that they selected, and some of them have stole, some of them were stolen from Africa. Some of them, yeah, their local chiefs or leaders sold them to. Some of them were sold to the white people. Some of them were stolen from the place. So it was a big, it was a long history, 400 years, a lot of different ways. But the ones that were chosen, it was not because they're better people. It's more because they had agricultural skills that they needed in America. So they picked the ones that knew how to grow rice. They picked the ones who knew farming techniques. And so they picked the ones from Africa who they didn't need to teach agriculture to. And so a lot of them. And a lot of this whole thing about discovering that, scientists would try to figure out why are Black people inferior. It was more about, that was even among some people who were trying to help black people, right? So Thomas Jefferson, the American president, wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia. And it's a really important moment in American history, because what he asked scientists to do, the question that he posed to America's sciences, and this is when anthropology was invented, right? What he could have said was, is there a difference between white people and Black people, or are we all the same? And they didn't know about genetics back then, but he just asked them, look at their bodies. Is there anything specific about Black people that you would never find in any white person? And they were trying to help Black people, some of them. And what those scientists found was that, no, there's nothing that you find in any white person that you cannot find in any Black person. There's nothing in any Black person that you cannot find in any white person. And so he could have asked the question, is there a difference? And the scientists probably would have said, no, there's no difference. It's just that we've been very mean to these people and we've made them do a lot of work, and there's a lot of violence. Millions of Black people died during slavery. It is being referred to as genocide now. But they didn't say that. The question he asked was, why are they different? Why are they inferior? And so if that's the question, the answer is automatically assumes that Black people are inferior. And so that's a really big moment in American history, because if he had said, are they inferior, then it would have allowed for them to answer yes or no. But what he said was, why are they inferior? Well, here's why. And let's look at this. They would measure their heads, and their heads are shaped differently, and look at their hands. So they just picked apart the Black people's bodies just to try to understand what is it that's inferior about them. Why are they slaves? I use one example. I'll end with this on that. You mentioned stereotypes being different in different countries. That's very true. One of the examples I use in my classes, I use Zheng He, the Chinese sailor, admiral, who sailed around the world and took thousands of people all the way around India, all the way to Africa, and then around to the west coast of Africa. And Ming Dynasty China was far more technologically advanced than Europe, right? They took 10,000 people basically around most of the known world, and they didn't produce any, Zheng He did not, the Chinese government at the time, the Chinese monarchy, the emperor was not interested in slavery. They did not kill anybody. They didn't, they did not, they had the technology, they had gunpowder. No one else had gunpowder. They could have used cannons. They could have killed so many people, but what did they do? They made friends. They made trade partners. The reason we in America call China the dishes, we call them China because archaeologists are still finding pieces of Zheng He's China that he gave to gifts to people all over Africa. Zheng He's crew, he died during the journey, but they took giraffes and zebras from Africa all the way back to Beijing. That's crazy, right? I can imagine giraffes on a boat going across the ocean, and then they present them to the emperor saying like, we brought this gift from Africa, from our new friends in Africa. So they could have done even more. They could have done the same thing that the British and the Dutch did, and they could have enslaved people. They could have killed millions of people. they chose not to. And so when people say, oh, it's just technology and it's just history, it's inevitable. No, European people chose to do those things. And China is a good comparison because they had even more technologies. They had even better ships. And they decided they just wanted people to trade with. They could have enslaved people too, but China decided not to. So, and so if you look at the early stereotypes of Black people in China, they were just curious, right? They were looking to meet these new different people, and the emperor wanted to make friends, and that's what Zheng He and his crew did. So I really suggest you read the history of that if you're not familiar with it. I had never heard of it until I was in college. I'm like, wow, this is an amazing story, and it's totally different from what Europeans did when they went to Africa, right? So it's kind of crazy.
There were two more questions earlier.
Okay. What are they? I still can't see chat. I don't know why.
Maybe stop sharing your screen. And then it should be at the bottom. Okay. So
okay.
Someone said, for the picture about equity, is there only 2 spots? If there was only 2 spots instead of 3, what should we do to keep the equity?
To keep the equity, if there were only 2, you mean if the tall guy wasn't there? Okay.
I think that's what they mean.
Yeah.
Well, the boxes.
Say it again. Okay.
Maybe it could be like if you move one box away.
If you move one of the boxes away and there's not enough, okay, so what if there was not enough to share between the 3 people to create equity, right? Okay, well, that's why you work together. You know, how much does anyone need? Like, could there be a way for everyone to see over the fence if the tall guy was also short? Let's say instead of taking a box away, let's make the tall guy short and say that he can't see over it either. This is all metaphorical. Maybe half the game he could stand on one person's shoulder and the other half of the game the other person can stand on his shoulder and they can help each other.
Or they could, right, if there was still 3 if there were still more boxes, maybe they could share a box. I don't know.
Maybe they could share a box. Yeah, you can share a box. They can stand on each other's shoulders. They could decide that, hey, let's skip this game and go find another box. Let's go find another box and maybe see if we have enough. But that's the thing. They just have to, the main answer is they need to work together to see if they can solve the problem. And it's not always easy. Sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes one person in this group might not feel like it's fair. You see that a lot with some white people now, because you hear a lot about white privilege in America. And that's part of one of the people who really hate what's going on right now is they feel like everyone's attacking white people. It's like, no, they're not necessarily attacking you and they're not blaming you for what happened. They're just saying that maybe your ancestors, your family had an easier time to get you. You were not born, you didn't, it's like the saying is, you were born on third base and you think you hit a triple. Baseball metaphor. You didn't hit a triple, you were just born on third place. Well, this other person was born on home plate, so they got to work their way to third base a little bit harder than you do. They have more challenges, and sometimes, yeah, it feels like it's not fair. But you have to think about fairness. There's fairness to the individual, but then there's fairness to a whole community of people sometimes. So, and again, there are no easy answers to it. That's why if there were easy answers, we would have solved all of this stuff a long time ago. I wish we could go back in time and just make slavery not happen, but it did.
Yeah.
And so now we have to deal with it.
Okay. So there's a few other questions. I'm going back a little bit. Does the welfare for poor help or worse the equity?
It depends. That's a very difficult welfare. So the question is, okay, I'm hearing a lot. You might want to mute. I'm hearing a lot of interference. Welfare can help. It doesn't always help. There are always individuals who squander the help that they're given, but the vast majority of people on welfare are helped by it, because think about it. If you can use, what welfare does is it takes some people, the poorest among us, it allows them to use the money they earn when they work. And now we have all these laws that you have to work to earn. You don't get welfare if you don't work for a period of time. So they have to work. And if you do work and you earn money, it's usually just enough to pay your rent and to buy groceries. Okay, so let's say welfare comes in and helps you buy groceries. So then you have a little bit of extra money. You can do other things with it. You can save it. and try to eventually buy property. And there are people who do that. It's hard, but there are people who manage to do that kind of thing. Or you can use that money to pay for an after school program for your kids, right? So what it does is that's like, welfare is like one of the boxes, right? And of course, there are going to be individuals who don't do that with the money. They waste it on things they don't need. But that's individuals. The vast majority of people who depend on welfare are really benefited by it. It's not a permanent solution. A better solution would be to address some of the issues with real estate purchasing, and a better solution might be to, there are people, this is why some people push for free universal childcare, because childcare is so expensive. I remember when we first had kids, I was shocked that for our 2 kids in daycare, while we were working, it was like well over $1,000 a month. When I was a single young guy, I had no idea how much childcare cost. And if you're working poor, you're working very hard, you're paying your rent, or in some cases paying your mortgage. But what welfare does is that it allows you to pay for Kuman, right? It allows you, and so it's one of the boxes with this equality, equity thing. So it can help, but it won't, we don't need welfare forever. It's just that, but we're not at a point where some people where some people are on the same level with everyone else. There are some people politically who want free college and free things like that. I don't know if that's the solution either. Again, these are difficult problems. I don't totally agree with that. I think it's a good idea, but I think it's just too difficult to achieve. We do have mechanisms to help people pay for college when they need it. We do have ways of lessening the burden for childcare. But what I think welfare does is it helps people pay for other things. And that's, most people do benefit from it, but there are some people, of course, who don't benefit from it. But there's always going to be individual examples of people who aren't using their resources the way they should be. And some of that comes into, so.
Yeah, there are 2 more questions.
I always give long answers.
Okay. What can the Asian community do for the Black community to help?
Good question. It's up to you. I mean, there's things, I could ask the same question. What can middle-class Black people like me do to help the Black community? Like my wife and I were talking, Bella and I were talking the other day. It's like, and she kind of challenged me. It's like, what are you doing? And I teach, and I teach stuff like this. I try to help with my students, but there are more hands-on ways that you can help. And, if you have ideas, you can help people, even if you just help one person, that can help. Some people think, well, if I can help Black people do things better or fix them in some way or something like that, and have more fathers in the home or something like that. It's not about fixing them. It's that those difficulties are still going to be there. So vote, run for office, select politicians that want to really solve issues and not just fight with the other party on both sides, right? Like, vote for people who have real ideas. Like, find out who's running for city council. That's where it starts, right? Get involved in local elections, because you can't just vote for president. You got to vote for, and sometimes local elections, they don't even tell you Republican or Democrat. It doesn't matter. What are your ideas, right? Find out what people believe in. Like, I don't want to vote for someone because they belong to a political party. I want to vote for someone because I like their ideas. And so that's the simplest thing, is like, find out what people are doing politically, and they can help change your community. They influence policy. Handing out money on the streets is not going to help many people. I mean, like, what's a better way to help a homeless person, for example? Giving them $5, or supporting your local homeless shelter that provides food and things, or volunteering there if you don't have money, like things like that. So you can apply the same thing to helping the Black community. Maybe you can have an idea that might resolve some of these issues. Work with them to talk about, what are we going to do about police? Like, how can we work with police rather than against police, right? They don't want to fight police. They don't want to be brutalized by police. They don't want to fight them. The police are not the enemy, but the problem is sometimes they act like it. How can we solve that? So maybe the Asian community can connect with the Black community and say, like, hey, there's 1,000 of us here, and we all vote. We vote for mayor, and this is what we want. Like, we Asian people want this, Black people want this, Latino people want this. We want to form a group of people who can work with the police to make sure that these things that people are protesting about don't happen here. So you don't have to change the world. You can change your neighborhood. You can change your community. Police love it when people do that, because sometimes they don't know what to do. They're just being police, but sometimes they need to be you know, you can work with them to find better ways to be police and that don't damage communities and don't keep people fear. A lot of Black people are scared to call the police right now because they don't know what's going to happen. You know, they you know, a lot of people were so angered by the George Floyd situation because Black men like me, I could imagine myself in that situation because the camera, you know, the other videos are coming out. He didn't do anything. The police said, oh, he was fighting. But now the more videos are coming out, he didn't do anything. They just threw him on the ground and put his knee on the neck. And that's why it made people so angry because he didn't do anything to deserve to be treated like that, and he's dead. So that's where some of the anger is from, because in Black men, I can very easily imagine myself, even with my PhD in my house in Cyprus, you know, I could get pulled over at a traffic stop and sneeze, and the officer would think I was doing something, but I was just sneezing, and they tased me, and then next thing you know, I'm on the ground, right? So, and that it tends to happen far more to Black men than other people, and so that's why I try to connect it to the history. There's been a long history of people stereotyping Black men as violent and as threats and things, and so, and there's some people who really believe it, even though they don't know they believe it. There are some implicit bias is the term they talk about a lot. So, but
yeah.
Anyway,
Someone else asked for the back to the equity picture. Could we remove the fence?
That would be like a revolution. That's what happened in China. That's what the Communist Party did in China in 1949. Hey, why is there fence anyway? That's good thinking. That's a good way to think. Why is there fence there anyway? Right? And then no one has to look over it. That's what. Now you're talking about socialism. Yeah, that would be. But you're right. Why does there have to be? It takes. You know, I joke, but yeah, it takes original ideas. That's the kind of fresh thinking that we need, right? That's sometimes we don't see the bigger problem because we're just looking at the minor issues. The bigger problem, yeah, you're right. You could look at it this way. You know, the whole problem here is that why is there a fence? You know, why should you have to pay to go in? Because they want people to, you know, the answer is there's a fence so that you can have home runs, and more importantly, that people will have to buy tickets to see the game. Because yeah, you could say they're all cheating. They're all kind of, you know, they're all cheating basically. But yeah, that's the kind of. But yeah, it takes original ideas. Sometimes we don't. Sometimes it takes. That's why your voice should be heard. Best thing you can do, regardless if you're Asian, Black, Latino, whatever, Native American, is make sure your voice gets heard. You know, speak up. Act up, you know, act out, speak up. If you see someone who's being told to shut up or being silenced, you know, help them. If you have a big following on WeChat or a lot of friends, and you have someone who has a very few followings, but they have a really important issue, take their message and say, hey, I can amplify this for you. Someone could say, you only have 10 followers on Twitter, but I have 10,000. Send it to me and I'll send it out to my 10,000. That's a very small thing, very easy thing to do. But now you're helping their voice be heard. And so it could be as simple as that. Share information, you know, none of this is going to change overnight. There is no magic bullet to fix this, right? And people's feelings are going to be hurt everywhere, but it's a difficult conversation because it's a difficult history. And all we need is, you know, you need some kind of empathy. You need to try to imagine yourself in that other person's situation. So, but that's a good question. Yeah, Edward, to everyone, thank you for that. Oh, thank you. You're welcome. Okay. Yeah, thank you. You ready? All right. Bye, Annie. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for listening. Yeah, it's just, you know, there's information out there, and PBS, public broadcasting. Let me share my screen before we go one more time. There is a website that you can go to if you want to hear more. And they have all their articles. That a lot of this research is based on pbs.org/race. Understandingrace.org has exercises that you can do. Just understanding diversity and difference. Tolerance.org. Moment Racism and Police Violence. That one's more specifically about police violence. And there's a lot of things out there. You can contact me at Cal State Long Beach. It's just my name, Scott.Wilson@CSULB. If you want some readings. But yeah, there's a lot of resources out there if you want to understand these things. And so I would highly recommend, maybe we can get back together again. We can watch that film about Asian Americans that PBS has right now. And you can see this. I'm going to unshare my screen. But PBS has an argument about the history of Asians in America. And so you'll hear some of the same things. Like I focused on Black people because that's what I use in my classes and I'm Black, but I also talk about the history of Asians in America. But this documentary on PBS I've heard is really good about the history of the struggles of Asians in America, not Asian immigrants, which I know most of this audience is Asian immigrants, recent Asian immigrants, but people, Asians in America who have been here for several generations. It's really interesting because they had some of the same issues. I mean, Asian people in the US couldn't own property for most of the 20th century until about the 1960s. Asians weren't allowed to own property. And so I know a lot of us own property here, but can you imagine not being able to buy a house legally because you're not white? Right, or Black, and which was kind of weird that the only two categories for most of the 20th century, well, until about the 1950s, the only two categories of citizenship in the U.S. where you had to either be white or Black. You could not be Asian, Native American, or Pacific Islander or anything like that. You weren't allowed to be a U.S. citizen, right? Can you imagine that? And if you're not a citizen, you weren't allowed to buy a house, right? So you can imagine how that ripples through, not the recent immigrants like most of you, but the Asians who've been here for over 100 years. They've had some of the same difficulties that Black immigrants have had. And so this, if you talk to Cambodians in Long Beach who have been here just since the 70s, they have some of the same issues that Black people have. So again, it's not about race, it's about poverty, right? So, okay, that's, oh wow, it's after 4 already. Oh my God, I didn't know what time it was. Okay, so let's do this again sometime. Pick a different topic. I don't know. Anything else? Leah is a very good facilitator. Thank you, Leah. Yeah, but we can do it again sometime. We'll be back. And I guess this was Chinese class, so obviously not Chinese today. My Chinese is not good enough to participate in your Chinese class. So,
yeah, but yeah, if any of you guys want to the slides, you can either contact Scott or me or Leah. We can send you the slides.
I'll post them online, maybe SlideShare. I'll do SlideShare like a Google Slides, and then I'll give Bella the link. I'll give Guanjun the link, and she can post it to WeChat if people are interested. So it'll be a very large file, so I think I'd rather just host it online somewhere because there are a lot of pictures in it, so it'll be a really big file, too big to email.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay. All right, thank you for listening.
Okay.
Yeah, I
Thank
hope
you,
it wasn't too
everyone.
far off. All right, bye. I'm gonna end it now. Stop recording.